Ryoutous and Rowtous armed mobs at Tynemouth Castle and the Longsands, a case from the Star Chamber, 1593. The following is a summary of a fascinating trial in 1593 that took place against the backdrop of Tynemouth Castle and the lucrative North Shields salt pans. The case was between the feuding parties of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the complainant, and the brothers of Peter Delaval, the defendants. What was the Star Chamber? The Star Chamber was a law court that was used to temper the power of the nobility, which local courts were not able to do successfully. Over time, it came to serve as the monarch's personal instrument of power and oppression, where verdicts could be passed down expediently and unopposed. The Star Chamber rose to prominence during the dissolution of the monasteries, gaining despotic power that enabled Henry VIII to break from the church and acquire its property. In the 17th century, it was abolished by the Puritan leaders of Parliament prior to the Civil War. The Star Chamber was a notorious and greatly feared institution for its corrupt and arbitrary rulings, as well as its cruel and unusual punishments. But in the late Tudor era we're dealing with here, it was still very much a valuable and respected authority. The Court of the Star Chamber of Elizabeth I, 1593. Henry, Earl of Northumberland versus Joshua Delaval, Ralph Delaval, Clement Delaval, Cuthbert Bates, James Reams, Thomas Ogle, Ralph Ogle, John Person, William Person. Bill of Complaint. These gentlemen and around 30 others armed with, quote, jacks of plates with privy cuts, steel caps, daggers, calavers, guns, gunpowder, pellets, horsemen's staves, forest bills, long-piked staves, bows, arrows, swords, daggers, and other weapons, end quote, were accused of attempting a surprise raid on a garrisoned Tynemouth Castle on the 19th of July, 1593. In addition, it was claimed there were a further 120 men stationed nearby and lying in ambush. Here's what is said to have happened. Quote, to the great terror and fear of your majesty's subjects inhabiting the towns and places near to the said castle did unlawfully, riotously, and routously, and in warlike manner assemble themselves at Tynemouth aforesaid upon the ground next to adjoining to the outer walls of the said castle. But for what intent or purpose your subject knoweth not, howbeit the said persons so assembled did at and from the north end or side of the said castle, then and there unlawfully, riotously, and routously take and carry away divers and sundry stones of your majesty's hearthstones for their own proper use, and behalf notwithstanding they were then and there forbidden to do so in the name and behalf of your majesty, and in taking and carriage away of the said stones, they, the said riotous persons, did use and utter speeches of this effect, that they would take and carry away the said stones, or otherwise would hazard their lives and skins, and for better performance of their said unlawful and riotous purpose, they, the said riotous persons, had at the same time and day caused and procured divers other persons to number of 120 in like warlike manner arrayed to assemble themselves in troops and companies near unto the said castle, and to lie in ambush in secret places near the said castle, that if they should require or resistance were made by your majesty's servants, subjects or soldiers of the said castle against the said unlawful enterprises, then they might come and assist the said riotous persons in their said unlawful enterprise, contrary to the laws and statutes of this your highness's realm. End quote. The Earl's attorney, Friar Moore, asserts that this mob tried essentially to storm Tynemouth Castle in order to steal stones for the salt pans at North Shields. He argues that this is particularly dangerous behaviour around one of the Queen's fortifications, especially one so close to Scotland, which could cause commotions and great uprisings there. He calls for these men to be arraigned before court to answer for their crimes and suffer severe and fitting punishment for these offences. Answers of Joshua Delaval, Clement Delaval, and Thomas Ogle. The defendants denied the charge. Firstly, they explained the business of Peter Delaval, elder brother to Joshua, Clement and Ralph. Quote, "1. Peter Delaval was lawfully possessed of certain coal mines in Preston, Monk Seaton, East Churton and Mid Churton, under the demise and grant of the Queen's most excellent Majesty, that now is unoccupied, the same as former, and for certain rent yearly payable to her Majesty, and was then likewise possessed of divers salt pans standing upon the river Tyne in the North Shields, under her Majesty's grant as firmer to her Majesty, and of other salt pans standing upon the said river, upon certain ground there, which the said Peter Delaval lately purchased of the Queen's most excellent Majesty, that it now is all which premises were part of the possessions of the late dissolved monastery of Tynemouth in the county of Northumberland." End quote. Due to the monopoly on the sale of coal held by the Corporation of Newcastle, Peter Delaval employed most of the coal he mined in the 8 salt pans he operated at North Shields, in the area which is today at the bottom of Tanner's Bank. 4 of these pans he owned outright, while the other 4 were jointly rented from the Queen. These grounds and the assets therein had come into the possession of the Crown after her father, Henry VIII, had seized the property of the Prior of Tynemouth around 60 years earlier. In operating salt pans, it was necessary to use a large quantity of hearthstones to contain the fire beneath them. These stones had in the past been taken without hindrance from Prior's Haven, presumably from Freestone Point to be precise, but also from the Bear Hares Rock near the top of the Longsands, and at several other points on the shoreline, more than a mile distant from the castle. That was until the 25th of June 1593, a month before the incident in question here, when they were apprehended by Thomas Poor, deputy captain of Tynemouth Castle, and a company of men who confiscated a boatload of hearthstones from the servants of Peter Delaval and warned them not to try this again. Then, on the 19th of July, Delaval's men were probably at Bear's Head on the Longsands, when they were approached by Thomas Poor again, with 18 men armed with, quote, "muskets, halberds, pikes, bows, and other weapons." Poor commanded them to desist from taking stones and to leave the area, which they refused to do. At this point, Poor ordered his men to ready for an assault. The defendants protested that they intended no harm and were providing these stones for Peter Delaval, who was in lawful possession of the salt pans. When Poor perceived this, he asked them to talk with him, which they did without coming to any agreement, before Poor departed and the defendants carried away their stones. Who was Peter Delaval? A Map and Its Meaning by Clavering and Rounding, Archaeologia Aliena, Series 5, Volume 40, 2011, shows Peter Delaval's salt pans at the Powburn estuary and has this to say about his mining enterprise. Quote, "In 1590, the Preston Colliery was owned by Peter Delaval, a scion of that family who had been apprenticed to a London merchant. He was obviously a capable man because he was persuaded to return to the north to manage the Earl's estates in Tynemouth. He bought property there and, as a farmer of the Queen's mines in Preston, developed the colliery both for himself and on behalf of the Earl." The relationship, end quote. The relationship between the Earl and Delaval enjoyed a reversal after this enmity between them. Peter was appointed deputy captain of Tynemouth Castle when Poor was dismissed soon after the trial. And as we see from the quote, they were partners in the coal trade and seemingly involved in some smuggling in getting coal to sea via Wellington Quay in order to circumvent the burgesses of Newcastle. Eventually, in 1599, their relationship turned sour and Delaval was dismissed from the role after being betrayed by the Earl to the authorities at Newcastle. In 1605, the Earl became implicated in the gunpowder plot through his kinsman Thomas Percy, whom he also made deputy of the castle. Subsequently, the king dispossessed Henry of Tynemouth Castle, along with his castles at Alnwick, Prudhoe and Cockermouth, before he was imprisoned in the Tower, ironically after a trial in the Star Chamber. Deposition. Joshua Delaval of Rivers Green. Joshua Delaval denied assembling an armed mob, but explains that they had 5 or 6 labourers with them who had a case of pistols as well as halberds and pickaxes for digging the stones out. A few unarmed boatmen were also present. The men were carrying swords and daggers and wearing some steel plate, as they feared resistance to their work from Thomas Poor and his troops. It was alleged by Poor that Peter Delaval was intent on crossing the Earl. Joshua Delaval denied this and said Poor spoke untruly. Poor then challenged both Joshua Delaval and Peter, who wasn't present, to a fight. It appears at a later date he then set upon Joshua Delaval on Walker Moor, 2 miles from Newcastle. Armed with swords and daggers, they fought hand to hand until Delaval disarmed Poor, afterwards returning his weapons to him. The defendant closes with the argument that Poor acted unlawfully and riotously when the defendant was simply taking stone from a place that they had done so for many years, while the reason they were armed was because Poor had threatened them before. Conclusion. Seeing as we can't typically find judgments from the Star Chamber, I'll give my interpretation of this dispute. I would guess the Chamber found the defendants not guilty, as Peter Delaval was in good favour with the Crown as a key coal and salt supplier to London. He even rented 4 of his salt pans from the Queen, so stifling his work was also threatening royal revenues. The blame in the dispositions is being placed squarely on Thomas Poor rather than the Earl of Northumberland. They don't want to become sworn enemies of the Earl, but they do feel wrongfully accused. The following points ought to be considered. 1. A key premise of the complaint seems false, in that it said the men go to the north side of the outer walls of the castle. That place is inaccessible, and the land at the front of the gatehouse is too small and would not be a place to take stone. They were clearly at the north end of the Longsands, and therefore, while still on the Earl's land, not invading the castle. The Earl portraying this as the castle being under attack is misleading and false. There's an implication of treason in that an attack on the castle and the Earl's soldiers is an attack on the Queen, and it is unbelievable that these men would attempt this. 2. The claim about this kind of behaviour sparking uprisings in Scotland is a big stretch, and its inclusion weakens the argument. 3. The list of weaponry seems exaggerated, and the claims of a further 120 men lying in ambush far-fetched. 4. It appears hearthstones had been taken from the shoreline for use in salt pans for a very long time. Thomas Poor produced no warrant when asked to that would give him the right to stop the removal of these stones. 5. The defendants claim that their weapons were carried off in self-defence should be taken on face value, given the prior threats from Poor. Ultimately, they're protecting their work and income. Therefore, in my view, the Earl brought this case more to make a futile point against his former business associate and try to censure the Delavals. It is unlikely to have led to a conviction. The Star Chamber Project. Please check out the great work of the Star Chamber Project that they have done to transcribe and digitise thousands of cases. It represents a mammoth contribution to our knowledge of this august, infamous, arcane, yet deeply intriguing institution. Thank you to Dave King of the Twitter account Northumberland and Durham Historical Docs for transcribing this case and sharing it with me.